Detective Sarah Chen had seen enough death to know the difference between natural and unnatural, but nothing had prepared her for what lay beneath the floorboards of 1247 Maple Street. The call came in at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly owner, had been awakened by what she described as scratching sounds coming from below her kitchen floor. When the scratching turned to what sounded like sobbing, she called the police. Sarah arrived to find two uniformed officers standing awkwardly in the kitchen, their faces pale in the harsh fluorescent light. Officer Martinez, a 20-year veteran, looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Detective, you're going to want to see this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The house was a Victorian-era relic, all creaking wood and faded wallpaper. Mrs. Henderson sat in her living room, wrapped in a threadbare robe, her eyes wide with terror. She kept mumbling about the sounds, how they'd been going on for weeks, but she'd thought it was just mice. Sarah knelt beside the hole. The officers had cut in the kitchen floor. The beam of her flashlight revealed a crawl space that shouldn't have existed according to the house's original blueprints. And there, in the far corner, was something that made her stomach lurch. A human skeleton, still wearing the remnants of a blue dress, lay curled in a fetal position. But that wasn't what made Sarah's blood run cold. It was the small digital recorder, placed carefully beside the skull, its red light still blinking. "Has anyone touched anything down there?" Sarah asked. "No, ma'am. We secured the scene the moment we saw it." Sarah called for the crime scene unit and the coroner. As she waited, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a discovery of old remains. The recorder was modern, maybe 5 years old at most. Someone had been down there recently. Mrs. Henderson shuffled into the kitchen, clutching a cup of tea with shaking hands. "Detective, I bought this house 15 years ago. The previous owner was a nice man, a doctor. He lived here alone for decades." "What was his name?" "Dr. Edmund Thorne. He moved to a retirement community in Florida. Lovely man, really. Used to grow the most beautiful roses in his backyard." Sarah made a note of the name. Something about this felt orchestrated, like a puzzle someone wanted solved. The placement of the recorder, the fact that Mrs. Henderson had only started hearing sounds recently, it all seemed too convenient as the crime scene team arrived and began their work. Sarah stepped outside into the cool morning air. The neighborhood was quiet, tree-lined streets filled with similar Victorian homes. Normal, peaceful. The kind of place where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. But Sarah had learned long ago that terrible things happened everywhere. The question was whether someone was just now letting them be found. The lab results came back faster than expected. The skeleton belonged to a woman, approximately 25 to 30 years old, who had been dead for at least 10 years. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull, but it was the contents of the digital recorder that sent chills down Sarah's spine. She sat in her office, headphones on, listening to the voice of a dead woman. The recording was crystal clear, as if it had been made yesterday. "My name is Lisa Moreau. If you're hearing this, it means I'm already dead." The voice was calm, eerily, composed for someone speaking their own death sentence. "I want you to know that I figured it out. I know who he is, and I know what he's been doing." Sarah paused the recording and grabbed her notepad. Lisa Moreau. She ran the name through the missing persons database and found a match immediately. Lisa Moreau, age 28, reported missing on October 15, 2013. Last seen leaving her job at Mercy General Hospital, where she worked as a nurse. The recording continued. He's been watching me for weeks, following me home, leaving little gifts on my doorstep. I thought it was sweet at first. Roses, always red roses. But then I found the photos. Sarah's pen stopped moving. Red roses. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned that Dr. Thorne grew beautiful roses in his backyard. The photos were of other women. Women I didn't recognize, but they all looked like me. Dark hair, small build, same age. In every photo they were smiling, but their eyes looked wrong, scared. And in the corner of each photo, someone had written a date and the word gardened. The recording crackled with static, then Lisa's voice returned, more urgent now. I confronted him today, told him I knew what he was doing. He just smiled and said I was special, that I would be the crown jewel of his collection. He said the others were just practice, but I was perfect. I'm recording this because I know he's coming tonight. I can see him through my kitchen window right now, standing under the streetlight, just watching. Sarah felt her heart rate quicken. She looked at the case file. Lisa Moreau had lived at 432 Oak Street, just 6 blocks from the Maple Street house where her body was found. The recording wasn't finished. If something happens to me, look for the others. He called it his bone garden. Said he was cultivating something beautiful, something eternal. I think the recording cut off abruptly. Sarah immediately put out a bolo for Dr. Edmund Thorne and contacted the Florida retirement community where he was supposedly living. The response came back within hours. Dr. Edmund Thorne had never been a resident there. In fact, according to their records, no one by that name had ever inquired about residency. She drove to the Maple Street house, now empty, while the investigation continued. The backyard was overgrown, but she could see the remnants of what had once been an elaborate rose garden. The soil was rich and dark, almost black dot. As she walked among the dead bushes, her foot hit something hard. Kneeling down, she brushed away the dirt and found a small metal nameplate, the kind used in botanical gardens. It read, Lisa, planted October 2013. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She called for the ground-penetrating radar unit and a full excavation team. If Lisa was the crown jewel, there were others buried here, possibly many others, as the sun began to set. Casting long shadows across the bone garden, Sarah realized she wasn't just investigating a murder. She was uncovering a methodical, long-term, killing spree by someone who saw human beings as flowers to be cultivated and harvested. And according to the retirement community, Dr. Edmund Thorne was still very much alive and completely off the grid. The excavation of Dr. Thorne's backyard revealed a horror beyond Sarah's worst imagination. Over the next 3 days, they uncovered the remains of 7 women, each buried with the same care as Lisa. Each had a metal nameplate with a name and planting date. Each grave was precisely spaced, creating a pattern that resembled a formal garden layout. Sarah spread the case files across her desk like tarot cards, revealing a terrible fortune. 7 victims, spanning 15 years. All women between the ages of 25 and 30. All with dark hair and petite builds. All nurses who had worked night shifts at various hospitals around the city. The earliest grave belonged to Amanda Cross, planted in 2008. The most recent, aside from Lisa, was Rebecca Martinez, dated March 2014, just 5 months after Lisa's disappearance. What disturbed Sarah most was the meticulous planning evident in every detail. The graves were arranged in a spiral pattern, with Lisa's grave at the center. Each woman had been buried with personal items, jewelry, photographs, small mementos. If Thorne was creating shrines rather than disposing of bodies. Dr. Marcus Webb, the forensic pathologist, knocked on Sarah's office door. His usually jovial demeanor was replaced by something darker. "You need to see this," he said, placing a manila folder on her desk. The toxicology reports came back on all 7 victims. They were all drugged with the same substance, a paralytic agent called succinylcholine. It's used in surgical procedures to temporarily paralyze patients during intubation. Something a doctor would have access to, exactly. But here's the disturbing part. The paralytic doesn't kill. It just immobilizes. These women were conscious when they were buried alive. Sarah felt the room spin slightly. The scratching sounds Mrs. Henderson had heard weren't from mice. They were from Lisa, still alive beneath the floorboards, using her final moments to create the recording that would expose her killer. "There's more," Webb continued. "I found trace amounts of the drug in Lisa's system, but not enough to have paralyzed her completely. Either Thorne made a mistake with the dosage, or she had built up some immunity." Sarah thought about Lisa's recording. The composure in her voice, the detailed information she'd gathered about Thorne's previous victims. Lisa had been fighting back, investigating her own stalker even as he closed in on her. "Doc, how long could someone survive buried alive under a house?" Webb's expression grew grim. "With an air pocket and minimal physical exertion, maybe 72 hours. But the psychological trauma would be unbearable." Sarah pulled up the timeline. Lisa had disappeared on October 15th. Mrs. Henderson had called police on October 18th about scratching sounds that had been going on for a few days. Lisa had spent her final days trapped beneath that kitchen floor, conscious and aware, recording her testimony for whoever might find her. The phone rang, interrupting Sarah's dark thoughts. It was Officer Martinez from the night of the discovery. "Detective, we've got a problem. I just ran Dr. Thorne's medical license through the state database. According to the records, Dr. Edmund Thorne died in a car accident in 1987. Someone's been using his identity for over 30 years. Asterisk." Sarah felt the case shift beneath her feet like quicksand. They weren't looking for Dr. Edmund Thorne. They were looking for someone who had stolen a dead man's identity and used it to gain access to hospitals, medical supplies, and most importantly, potential victims. "Martinez, I need you to pull everything you can find on the real Edmund Thorne. Death certificate, family members, anyone who might know how someone could have stolen his identity." As she hung up the phone, Sarah stared at the crime scene photos. Spread across her desk, 7 women, all carefully selected and methodically killed by someone who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Someone who was still out there, and if the pattern held, he was already hunting his next victim. The real Dr. Edmund Thorne had been 28 years old when he died in a car accident on a rainy night in November 1987. He was unmarried, had no children, and his parents had died years earlier. He was, as Sarah's research revealed, the perfect victim for identity theft. But what made the theft particularly insidious was its timing. In 1987, computer databases were primitive, and cross-reference information between agencies was nearly impossible. Someone could have walked into a registrar's office with a copy of Thorne's birth certificate and medical school transcripts, and assumed his identity with minimal risk of detection. Sarah sat across from Margaret Thorne Whitfield, the real doctor, Thorne's only surviving relative, a cousin who lived in Portland. Margaret was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and precise in her recollections. "Edmund was brilliant," Margaret said, pouring tea from a delicate china set. "He graduated top of his class from medical school, had been accepted into a prestigious surgical residency. The accident happened just 2 weeks before he was supposed to start. Who would have known about his death? Who had access to his personal documents? Margaret considered this carefully. Edmund lived alone, but he had a roommate in medical school. They were quite close. After the accident, this roommate helped me clean out Edmund's apartment. He was very helpful, very considerate, even offered to return Edmund's medical textbooks to the school. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Do you remember his name? Of course. Such a nice young man, David Millfield. He was a year behind Edmund in school, studying psychiatry, if I recall correctly. Sarah made careful notes. A psychiatric student would have knowledge of human behavior, psychological manipulation, and access to medical supplies. Did you stay in touch with David after that? For a while, yes. He sent me a card every year on Edmund's birthday, which I thought was terribly sweet. But then the cards stopped coming, maybe 10 years ago. I assumed he'd moved on with his life. Sarah left Portland with a name and a new direction for her investigation. Back at her desk, she ran David Millfield through every database she could access. What she found made her blood run cold. David Millfield had also died in 1995, 8 years after Edmund Thorne's death. But unlike Thorne's accident, Millfield's death was suspicious a house fire that consumed his apartment and everything in it, including any dental records or DNA samples that could be used for identification. The official report suggested that Millfield had fallen asleep while smoking and knocked over a candle. But Sarah noticed something the original investigators had missed. The fire had started in 3 separate locations, a clear indication of arson. Someone had killed David Millfield and destroyed all evidence of his identity, just as they had stolen Edmund Thorne's. But why kill Millfield if the goal was to use Thorne's identity? Sarah studied the timeline again. Thorne died in 1987. Millfield died in 1995. The first victim, Amanda Cross, was killed in 2008. There was a 13-year gap between Millfield's death and the first murder. She called Dr. Webb with a new question. Marcus, is it possible that our killer had medical training but never completed it? Someone who knew enough to use surgical drugs but might not have been a practicing physician? Absolutely. A few years of medical school would be enough to understand pharmacology and basic anatomy. Why? Sarah explained her theory. The killer had been David Millfield, Edmund Thorne's roommate from medical school. After Thorne's death, Millfield had stolen his identity, but something had gone wrong. Maybe the deception was discovered, or maybe Millfield was struggling with the psychiatric studies that would have given him insight into his own developing pathology. So in 1995, David Millfield faked his own death and disappeared completely, emerging years later as the fake Dr. Edmund Thorne. The 13-year gap represented his metamorphosis from identity thief to serial killer. But if Sarah was right, they weren't looking for David Millfield either. They were looking for someone who had killed 2 men and stolen their identities. Someone who had been perfecting the art of disappearing for over 30 years. Someone who was probably already planning his next transformation. Sarah's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing hospital employment records, she noticed that each victim had worked at a facility where a Dr. Edmund Thorne had served as a consulting psychiatrist. Always on short-term contracts, always working night shifts. The pattern was meticulous. Thorne would arrive at a hospital, spend several weeks evaluating staff for a fictional workplace stress study, and then disappeared just before one of the nurses he'd interviewed vanished. By the time the connection might have been made, he was already gone, leaving behind glowing references and no forwarding address. But Sarah found something the killer hadn't counted on: security footage. Mercy General Hospital, where Lisa Moreau had worked, had upgraded their surveillance system in 2013, just months before Lisa's disappearance. The archived footage showed a man in his 50s, average height and build, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore expensive suits and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. Sarah enhanced the images and distributed them to hospitals throughout the region. The response was immediate. Dr. Patricia Vance from St. Mary's Hospital called within hours. "Detective, I know this man. He was here last month, supposedly conducting research on night shift fatigue. He interviewed several of our nurses, including one who fits the profile of his previous victims." Sarah's heart raced. "What's her name?" "Jennifer Walsh. She's 27, dark hair, works nights in the ICU. She took a leave of absence too. Weeks ago, said she was feeling unsafe, like someone was following her." Sarah was already reaching for her car keys. "Dr. Vance, I need Jennifer Walsh's address immediately. And I need you to pull any surveillance footage you have of this man. From his time at your hospital." The drive to Jennifer Walsh's apartment took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Sarah called for backup and contacted the tactical team. If Jennifer was still alive, they might be interrupting an abduction in progress. The apartment building was in a quiet residential neighborhood, similar to the areas where the other victims had lived. Sarah noted the strategic positioning, close enough to hospitals for the victims to feel safe, isolated enough for the killer to observe them undetected. Jennifer's apartment was on the second floor. Sarah climbed the stairs with her weapon drawn, listening for any sounds that might indicate someone was inside. The hallway was eerily quiet. She knocked softly on the door. "Jennifer, this is Detective Chen with the police. We need to speak with you about your safety." No response. Sarah tried the door handle and found it unlocked, which sent every instinct into high alert. She pushed the door open slowly, scanning the small living room. The apartment showed signs of a struggle. A lamp was overturned, books scattered across the floor, and there were drag marks leading from the living room toward the bedroom. But no blood, no obvious signs of violence. Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Detective, this is Officer Martinez. We've got units surrounding the building, but there's something you need to know. We found Jennifer Walsh's car in the parking garage. The trunk was open, and there were zip ties and duct tape inside." Sarah's blood chilled. The killer had Jennifer, but he hadn't taken her far. He was probably still in the area, possibly still in the building. She moved toward the bedroom, following the drag marks. The room was empty, but the window was open, and a fire escape ladder led down to an alley behind the building. On the windowsill, Sarah found something that made her stomach drop. A red rose, still fresh, with a small card attached. The message was written in the same precise handwriting she'd seen on the grave markers. "The garden must be tended. The harvest approaches." But this time, there was something different. A second line, written in a different hand, shakier and desperate. "Help me, he has me. Storage unit, 247, Riverside Self-Storage." Jennifer was still alive, and she was fighting back, just like Lisa had. But Sarah didn't know how much time they had left. As she coordinated the search with the tactical team, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was all too easy. The unlocked door, the obvious clues, the message Jennifer had somehow managed to leave behind. It felt like a trap. Riverside Self-Storage sat on the outskirts of town, a sprawling complex of metal buildings that stretched across several acres. Sarah arrived with a tactical team just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows between the rows of storage units. The manager, a nervous man named Pete Kowalski, met them at the entrance with a master key ring and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Unit 247 is in the back section," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Been rented for about 5 years by a guy named Thomas Brennan. Always paid in cash, never caused any trouble." Sarah made a note of the name. Another identity, probably. Stolen like the others. "Did you ever see him?" "A few times. Average-looking guy, maybe 55, 60. Drove different cars. Always something nondescript. Came by mostly at night." The tactical team spread out as they approached the storage unit. Sarah could see that Unit 247 was larger than the others around it, with electrical service that most storage units didn't have. Through the small gap at the bottom of the metal door, she could see light coming from inside. The team leader, Sergeant Rodriguez, positioned his men around the unit while Sarah tried to listen for sounds from within. She could hear something, a faint tapping, rhythmic and desperate. Morse code. Jennifer was alive and trying to communicate. Sarah had learned Morse code years ago from her grandfather, a Navy veteran. The tapping spelled out SOS-HERE. Juarez gave the hand signal, and his team cut the lock on the storage unit door. They rolled it up quickly, weapons drawn and ready. What they found inside defied Sarah's worst expectations. The storage unit had been converted into a makeshift medical facility. There were surgical lights, an operating table, cabinets filled with medical supplies, and glass containers holding what appeared to be preserved human organs. The walls were covered with photographs of all the victims, arranged chronologically like a twisted timeline. But it was the far corner of the unit that made Sarah's heart nearly stop. Jennifer Walsh was strapped to a metal table, conscious but barely able to move. 4 lines ran from her arms to a bag of clear fluid, likely the paralytic drug Thorne had used on his other victims. But the dosage was lighter this time, keeping her conscious enough to tap out her desperate message. Standing beside her, completely calm and apparently unsurprised by the police presence, was a man in surgical scrubs. He was older than the hospital footage had suggested, maybe 65, with grey hair and the kind of face that would be forgotten in a crowd 5 minutes later. "Dr. Edmund Thorne, I presume," Sarah said, her weapon trained on him. The man smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Actually, Detective, Dr. Thorne has been dead for over 30 years, as has David Millfield and Thomas Brennan and several others whose names you'll never learn. I've been many people over the years. What's your real name? Does it matter? Names are just costumes we wear. I prefer to think of myself as a gardener, someone who cultivates beauty and preserves it for eternity." Sarah stepped closer, keeping her weapon steady. "You're under arrest for the murders of Lisa Moreau, Amanda Cross, Rebecca Martinez, and 4 other women. Murders." The man seemed genuinely puzzled. "Detective, you misunderstand my work entirely. I don't kill these women. I transform them. I turn their fleeting mortality into something permanent and beautiful." Rodriguez and his team moved in to secure the suspect while paramedics rushed to Jennifer's side. She was weak but coherent, and the early intervention had prevented the full paralysis that had doomed the other victims. As the killer was led away in handcuffs, he turned back to Sarah with that same cold smile. "You think this ends anything? Detective, you think you've solved some puzzle. You have no idea how deep this garden grows." Sarah watched the ambulance carry Jennifer to safety, but the killer's words echoed in her mind. Something about his demeanor suggested this wasn't over, that everything they'd found was exactly what he'd wanted them to find. As crime scene, technicians began cataloging the horrific contents of the storage unit. Sarah realized they might have rescued Jennifer, but they were still no closer to understanding who their killer really was, or why he'd led them so directly to his lair. It felt less like a capture and more like the opening move in a game she didn't yet understand. The man who had called himself Dr. Edmund Thorne sat in the interrogation room like he was attending a faculty meeting. His posture was relaxed, his hands folded neatly on the metal table, his expression mildly interested in the proceedings. He had refused to give his real name, refused a lawyer, and seemed genuinely entertained by the entire situation. Sarah had spent 2 days preparing for this interview. She had studied every case file, every victim profile, every piece of evidence they'd collected. She knew the killer's methods better than anyone, but she still felt like she was walking into a trap. "Let's start with something simple," Sarah said, activating the recording device. "How many women have you killed?" "I've already told you, Detective. I don't kill women, I preserve them. And to answer your question more precisely, I've completed my work with 17 subjects over the past 15 years. Sarah kept her expression neutral, but inside she was reeling. They'd only found 7 bodies in the garden and had evidence of 3 additional victims from the storage unit. That left 7 more women whose fates were unknown. Where are the others? Scattered across the country, Detective. I've moved frequently over the years. Each location required its own garden, its own cultivation space. I'm quite proud of the variety I've achieved." The killer spoke about mass murder like he was discussing horticulture. Sarah had interviewed dozens of criminals, but she'd never encountered someone so completely detached from the horror of their actions. Why nurses? Why women who worked night shifts? Practical considerations, mostly. Nurses work alone, often. In isolated circumstances, they're accustomed to helping people, which makes them easier to approach. And their medical knowledge means they understand what's happening to them during the preservation process. That awareness adds a certain intensity to the experience. Sarah felt sick. You wanted them to know they were dying. I wanted them to appreciate the transformation. Death is such a crude word for what I do. I prefer to think of it as a transition from temporary beauty to eternal preservation. What about Lisa Moreau? She figured out what you were doing. For the first time, the killer's expression shifted slightly. Something that might have been respect flickered across his features. Lisa was exceptional. Most of my subjects accept their fate once the paralytic takes effect. But Lisa fought back even while chemically restrained. She turned her final hours into an investigation. Quite admirable, really. She exposed you. She delayed me, nothing more. I had always planned to move on after completing my work with her. Lisa simply accelerated the timeline. Sarah leaned forward. "But you made a mistake. You let her record that message, did I?" The killer tilted his head slightly. "Or did I ensure that someone would eventually find my garden?" "Detective, you've been assuming that your investigation surprised me, but I've been watching you since the moment you discovered Lisa's remains." Sarah's blood turned cold. "What are you talking about? You think Mrs. Henderson's complaint about scratching sounds was coincidental?" "I made those sounds, Detective. I wanted Lisa found. I wanted you to start digging. The room seemed to spin around Sarah. Why? Because I'm retiring, detective. 15 years is long enough for any career. But I couldn't simply walk away and leave my work unrecognized. I needed someone to understand what I had accomplished. Someone to appreciate the artistry of it. Sarah realized she was dealing with something far more dangerous than a serial killer driven by compulsion or rage. This was someone who had orchestrated his own capture as the final act of an elaborate performance. You led us to Jennifer Walsh. I gave you the opportunity to save her. Yes. Consider it my gift to you. One life preserved in exchange for the recognition of my life's work. Recognition. Sarah's voice was sharp with anger. You're going to spend the rest of your life in prison for murdering 17 women. The killer smiled again, that same cold expression she was beginning to hate. Prison, detective. You still don't understand. You caught Thomas Brennan, who was really David Millfield, who was really Edmund Thorne. But none of those men were ever real. They were all just roles I played. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet again. Then who are you? I'm no one, detective. I'm everyone. I've been so many people for so long that I've forgotten who I was before I started gardening. And that's the beautiful thing about what I do. I don't just preserve my subjects in death. I preserve myself in anonymity. The interview continued for 3 more hours. But the killer revealed nothing more of substance. He spoke eloquently about his methods, his philosophy, his appreciation for what he called the aesthetics of preservation. But he never once mentioned his real name, his background, or any detail that might help them understand who he had been before he became a killer. As Sarah left the interrogation room, she realized that even in custody, the man was still controlling the narrative. He had given them exactly what he wanted them to have, and nothing more. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a terrible thought was beginning to form. If he had been planning his capture all along, what else had he been planning? Sarah's worst fears were confirmed when the forensics team finished processing the storage units. Hidden behind a false wall, they found a computer system that contained detailed files on hundreds of potential victims across the country. The killer hadn't been working alone, he'd been part of a network. The computer files revealed a sophisticated operation that spanned multiple states and possibly decades. There were profiles of women who matched the killer's preferred type, surveillance photos taken outside hospitals and nursing schools, and, most disturbing of all, correspondence with other individuals who shared his obsession with what they called preservation. Dr. Angela Foster, the FBI's leading expert on serial killer networks, flew in from Quantico to review the evidence. Sarah had worked with Foster before and respected her expertise, but even Foster seemed shaken by what they'd uncovered. This isn't just a serial killer, Foster said, scrolling through the digital files. This is an organized group of individuals who have been sharing information, techniques, and possibly victims for years. The correspondence was written in coded language, but the meaning was clear. The network called itself the Gardner Society, and members referred to each other by botanical names. Their captured killer had been Rosebud, specializing in what they called nightshade cultivation, the targeting of night shift nurses. "Look at this," Foster said, pulling up a message. Dated 6 months earlier, Rosebud is announcing his retirement and asking for volunteers to tend his remaining seedlings. Someone else was supposed to take over his operation. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Jennifer Walsh, and possibly others. These files contain profiles of 12 nurses who matched the victim type, all working at hospitals within a 3-hour drive of here. Sarah immediately ordered protective details for all 12 women, while Foster continued analyzing the network's communications. What they found painted an even more disturbing picture. The Gardner Society had been operating for at least 20 years, with members in California, Texas, Florida, and the Northeast. Each member specialized in different victim types: nurses, teachers, social workers, but they all shared the same methodology and the same twisted philosophy about preserving beauty through death. "This changes everything," Foster said. "Your killer wasn't just a serial murderer. He was part of what might be the largest organized killing network we've ever encountered." The implications were staggering. If the network was as extensive as the files suggested, there could be hundreds of victims across the country, all killed by individuals who saw themselves as artists rather than murderers. But it was the most recent communications that made Sarah's blood run cold. Messages dated within the past week, sent after the killer's arrest, indicated that other members of the network were already mobilizing. "They're not shutting down," Sarah realized. "They're adapting." Foster nodded grimly. "And they're angry. Look at this message from someone calling himself Oleander. The garden has been compromised. Time for pruning. Begin harvest protocols immediately." Sarah's phone rang. It was Officer Martinez, and his voice was tight with fear. "Detective, we've got a problem. 3 of the nurses under protective detail have gone missing. Their security details found signs of struggle, but no witnesses, no surveillance footage. Whoever took them knew exactly how to avoid detection." Sarah looked at Foster, who was already reaching for her phone to call in federal resources. "It's starting," Foster said. "The network is going to ground, which means they're going to eliminate any evidence that could lead back to them, including witnesses and the nurses." Foster's expression was grim. "If the pattern holds, they have maybe 72 hours before the network completes what they call the final harvest. We need to find them before the Gardner Society disappears forever." Sarah realized that arresting one killer had only revealed the tip of an iceberg. They weren't just dealing with a serial murderer anymore. They were facing an organized network of killers who had been perfecting their methods for decades, and now the network knew they were being hunted. The search for the 3 missing nurses led Sarah and the FBI task force to an abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of the county. The Millbrook State Hospital had been closed for 15 years. Its buildings left to decay while the state argued over demolition costs. But someone had been using the facility recently. Fresh tire tracks in the overgrown parking lot, new locks on several doors, and the faint hum of generators hidden in the basement all indicated recent activity. "This is their central processing facility," Foster said, studying the buildings. Layout on her tablet. "Look at the original blueprints. It has everything they'd need. Operating theaters, refrigeration systems, crematoriums for disposal. The perfect place for a final harvest." Sarah coordinated with the tactical teams, while Foster worked with technicians to intercept any communications from the building. What they discovered was a race against time. The intercepted radio chatter revealed that the network had gathered at Millbrook for what they called emergency protocols. They were going to eliminate all evidence of their operation, including the 3 kidnapped nurses and possibly other victims they'd been holding at different locations. "We're not just dealing with our original killer's network," Foster realized. "This is a convergence. Members from across the country have come here for this final operation." The tactical assault on Millbrook State Hospital began at dawn. Sarah accompanied the lead team as they breached the main building, moving through corridors that reeked of disinfectant and decay. They found the first evidence of the network's activity in what had once been the hospital's surgery wing. 3 operating rooms had been restored to working condition, complete with modern medical equipment and the same preservation apparatus they'd found in the storage unit. But the rooms were empty. Fresh bloodstains on the operating tables indicated recent use, but there were no victims, no perpetrators, no evidence of where everyone had gone. Sarah's radio crackled with reports from other teams searching the building. They'd found living quarters in the old psychiatric wards, stockpiles of medical supplies, and detailed records of the network's activities going back years, but no people. It was Foster who made the connection. The crematoriums, she said. If they're destroying evidence, they'd need the basement level where the original crematoriums were located. Sarah led her team down a narrow staircase that descended into the hospital's bowels. The air grew thick with the smell of burning flesh and chemicals. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the concrete walls, and the sound of industrial machinery echoed through the corridors. They found them in the main crematorium chamber. 7 individuals in surgical scrubs were systematically destroying evidence, while 3 women lay strapped to gurneys, alive but paralyzed. The scene was a nightmare of clinical efficiency. The network members worked with the same calm precision their captured colleague had displayed, treating mass murder like a routine medical procedure. FBI, nobody move, Foster shouted as the tactical team flooded the room. What happened next would haunt Sarah for the rest of her career. Instead of surrendering, the network members began what they called their final protocol. 3 of them moved toward the kidnapped nurses with syringes filled with what Sarah assumed was a lethal injection, while the others began destroying computer equipment and files. The tactical team had seconds to act. Gunfire erupted in the confined space as officers tried to stop the network members without hitting the victims. Sarah dove toward the nearest gurney, knocking away a syringe just as one of the killers was about to inject its contents. When the shooting stopped, 4 network members were dead. 2 were wounded and in custody, and 1 had escaped through a maintenance tunnel that connected to the old hospital's heating system. The 3 nurses were alive but traumatized. Sarah recognized one of them as Maria Santos, a night shift ICU nurse from St. Mary's Hospital who had been under protective detail when she was taken. How many others? Sarah asked. Maria, as paramedics worked to counteract the paralytic drugs. In her system, they kept talking about finishing their collections, Maria whispered. There are others, at different locations. They said this was just the beginning of the end. Sarah's heart sank. Even with most of the network captured or killed, they had likely saved only a fraction of the victims. The escaped member could lead them to other facilities, other victims. But he could just as easily disappear and start the cycle all over again. Foster was already coordinating with field officers across the country, using the intelligence they'd gathered to identify other potential network locations. But Sarah knew it would take months, maybe years, to unravel the full extent of the Gardner Society's operations. As they evacuated Millbrook State Hospital, Sarah caught sight of something that made her blood freeze. Carved into the concrete wall near the crematorium entrance, barely visible in the emergency lighting, was a message. The garden eternal grows in many soils. Oleander, 3 months after the raid on Millbrook State Hospital, Sarah thought the nightmare was over. The surviving network members were in federal custody. The FBI had identified and rescued 12 additional victims from locations across 3 states, and the media had moved on to other stories. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something crucial. She was reviewing case files in her office when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something made her answer it anyway. Detective Chen. The voice was calm, cultured, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. I believe you've been looking for me. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. Who is this? You may call me Oleander. I was quite impressed with your work at Millbrook, though I must say your tactical team's aim could use improvement. They damaged some irreplaceable research materials. Sarah signaled to Officer Martinez, who immediately began tracing the call. Where are you? Close. Enough to have watched you leave your apartment this morning. The blue sedan, license plate for 72JNK. You stopped for coffee at Murray's Diner, black with 2 sugars. You really should vary your routine, detective. Predictability is dangerous in our line of work. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She looked out her office window, scanning the parking lot for any sign of surveillance. What do you want? To congratulate you, primarily. You've accomplished something remarkable. You've forced us to evolve. Us. The Gardner Society didn't end with Millbrook, detective. We've simply adapted to your new reality. Scattered operations, smaller cells, more careful selection processes. In many ways, you've made us more efficient. Sarah felt sick. How many what, detective? How many new gardens we've planted? How many subjects we've preserved? How many cities now host our work? Oleander chuckled softly. The beauty of a network is that it can regrow from the smallest cutting. Martinez gave her a thumbs up. They had a location on the call. Sarah kept Oleander talking while tactical teams were dispatched. You made a mistake calling me, Sarah said. We're tracing this call. I'm counting on it, detective. I want you to find me. I want you to see what we've accomplished since Millbrook. The line went dead. Sarah and the tactical team raced to the traced location, a small office building downtown. They found the phone Oleander had used burner cell sitting on an empty desk in a vacant office space. Next to it was a manila envelope, with Sarah's name written in the same precise handwriting she'd seen on the grave markers. Inside the envelope were photographs. Recent photographs of women who matched the killer's victim profile, taken outside hospitals, nursing schools, and apartment buildings. At least 20 different women, all unaware they were being stalked. But it was the final photograph that made Sarah's hands shake. It showed her own apartment building, taken from across the street. Written on the back in Oleander's handwriting, the garden grows in many directions. Detective, some gardeners prefer different varieties of flowers. Sarah realized with growing horror that she had become a target, not because she posed a threat to the network, but because she represented a new type of victims, someone who had seen their work, understood their methods, and could appreciate what they called their artistry. She was no longer hunting the network. She was being hunted by it. As Sarah coordinated protection for the 20 women in the photographs, she couldn't escape the feeling that Oleander was still watching, still planning. The network had evolved beyond their original pattern, and she had no idea what they were capable of now. But she knew one thing with certainty. The game was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. Sarah's apartment felt like a prison. Federal agents maintained surveillance from the building across the street. Motion sensors covered every entrance, and she hadn't left the building without an armed escort in 2 weeks. But despite all the security, she couldn't shake the feeling that Oleander was still out there, watching and waiting. The photographs he'd sent had led to a coordinated protection effort across multiple states. 19 of the 20 women were now in protective custody or had been relocated to safe houses. But the 20th woman, a pediatric nurse named Rachel Kim from Seattle, had vanished 3 days earlier. Sarah knew what that meant. The network was still operational, still killing, and still using her investigation as a roadmap for their activities. Dr. Foster called with an update that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. "We've identified at least 12 active cells across the country," Foster said. "They're using encrypted communications and dead drops now, completely different from the centralized system we uncovered. Your friend Oleander has turned them into something much more dangerous. How many victims? We're not sure. The new cells are smaller, more careful, but potentially more frequent in their activities. Instead of one killer taking years to select and prepare victims, we're looking at multiple killers working simultaneously." Sarah stared out her apartment window at the agents positioned across the street. "They're not just preserving women anymore, are they? No. We found evidence that they've expanded their victim profile. Men, children, elderly victims in network has become something beyond what we originally understood." That night, Sarah made a decision that would either end the nightmare or cost her life. She disabled her security system, slipped past the federal surveillance, and drove to the one place she knew Oleander would eventually appear, the original crime scene at 1247 Maple Street. The house was still empty, wrapped in crime scene tape that fluttered in the cold wind. Sarah parked across the street and waited. She didn't have to wait long. A figure emerged from the shadows of the backyard, moving with the same calm precision she'd observed in all the network members. Oleander was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of unremarkable features that would be forgotten minutes after a casual encounter. He walked directly to Sarah's car and got into the passenger seat without invitation. "Detective Chen, I was wondering when you'd decide to end this dance." Sarah kept her hand on her weapon but didn't draw it. "Where is Rachel Kim?" "Safe, for now. Consider her insurance against any rash actions on your part." "What do you want?" Oleander studied her with the same detached interest she'd seen in the original killer. "I want you to understand something, Detective. Your investigation didn't stop us. It transformed us. We're not the same organization you discovered 6 months ago. We're something new, something better. You're still murdering innocent people, are we?" Oleander tilted his head slightly. "Or are we preserving beauty that would otherwise be lost to time? You've seen our work, Detective. You understand the artistry involved. Part of you appreciates what we accomplish." Sarah felt sick at the realization that he was partially right. The clinical precision, the careful selection of victims, the elaborate preservation methods, there was an undeniable artistry to their horror, and recognizing it made her feel complicit. "The network is shutting down," Oleander continued, "not because of your investigation, but because we've achieved something greater. We've inspired others, independent operators who share our philosophy but work outside our organization. The garden is growing wild, Detective, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Where is Rachel?" Oleander smiled and handed her a small piece of paper with an address. "Consider her my gift to you. A final subject preserved not for eternity, but for salvation. She's alive, Detective. and she remained that way as long as you remember that. Some gardens can never be fully uprooted. He got out of the car and walked back toward the shadows. Sarah called for backup while racing to the address he'd given her, but she knew it would be too late. By the time tactical teams arrived, Oleander would be gone, disappeared into the same anonymity that had protected him for years. She found Rachel, Kim, in a storage facility similar to the one where they'd captured the original killer. She was alive but traumatized, strapped to the same type of preservation apparatus they'd seen before. But this time, the machinery hadn't been activated. Oleander had kept his word. As paramedics treated Rachel and crime scene technicians processed the facility, Sarah realized that Oleander had been telling the truth about something else. This wasn't an ending. It was a transformation. The original Gardeners Society was gone, but its philosophy had spread like seeds on the wind. Independent killers inspired by their methods were already active in other cities, other states. The network had evolved beyond organization into ideology, and ideologies were much harder to kill than organizations. Sarah stood in the empty storage facility, surrounded by the evidence of horrors she was still discovering, and understood that her investigation had accomplished something she'd never intended. She hadn't stopped the killers. She'd helped them become something worse. The garden was eternal, and it was growing everywhere. As she drove home through the quiet streets of her city, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the darkness, Oleander was watching and planning the next phase of an evolution she had inadvertently begun. The case files would eventually be closed. The survivors would try to rebuild their lives. The media would move on to other tragedies, but the garden would continue to grow, tended by gardeners whose names she would never learn, in places she would never find, preserving beauty in ways that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The Bone Garden was eternal, and Detective Sarah Chen had become its most unwilling cultivator. That was the end of the story. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe so I can continue making videos. Bye. See you in the next one.